6 years ago, the University of Maryland announced with great fanfare that it had made a leap to one of the nation's most powerful athletic conferences, a move that carried the promise of riches and prestige. This week, the gambit blew up in spectacular fashion over 3 tumultuous days during which the president announced his retirement, the football coach was fired and the chairman of the university's governing board resigned. The trigger was the death of a 19-year-old football player named Jordan McNair, who collapsed from heat stroke after practice in the sweltering heat in May and died 2 weeks later. The resulting controversy became a power struggle fed by enormous financial and political pressures. And hovering over it all was the question of who at the University of Maryland would be held responsible for the McNair tragedy. Ultimately, the week's turbulence brought to the fore tensions among those trying to protect a big-time college athletic program and those who feared that the handling of Mr. McNair's death was severely damaging the university's image and a $1.5 billion fundraising campaign aimed at elevating the school's academic standing. "We have got politicians involved, students upset and the public wondering what's going on," said Mike Fryman, a former president of the Terrapin Club, an athletic donors organization. A three-way battle was waged among the university president, Wallace Stillo, the football coach, DJ Durkeen, and the politically connected chairman of the Board of Regents, James T. Brady. By the end of the week, Mr. Durkeen and Mr. Brady were out, and Mr. Lowe was headed into retirement at the end of the academic year. The governor, Larry Hogan, a Republican seeking re-election in a blue state, also entered the fray. As public pressure mounted, with university donors growing upset and his Democratic challenger denouncing his inaction, Governor Hogan voiced his displeasure about how the board was handling the crisis. The trouble grew on Tuesday after the board announced, as Mr. Lowe looked on visibly upset, that Mr. Durkeen would remain as the school's coach, despite a report highly critical of the football program's culture. Mr. Lowe, who had pushed for the 2014 move to the football-oriented Big Ten Conference, wanted to dismiss Mr. Durkeen but was overruled by the Brady-led board. The resulting public furor emboldened Mr. Lowe to buck the board's wishes and fire Mr. Durkeen on Wednesday. Mr. Brady stepped down the next day, having lost the support of Governor Hogan, whose campaign he ran in 2014. This account of the last week of maneuvering is based on interviews with more than a dozen people close to the process, most of whom declined to be identified because they were not authorized to speak publicly about private conversations. Through representatives, Mr. Lowe and Mr. Durkeen declined to comment. Late last week, the 17-member board met at the University System of Maryland headquarters in Baltimore. It received Mr. Lowe, Damon Evans, the athletic director, and Mr. Durkeen one by one. The meeting was intended to resolve a crisis that started with Mr. McNair's death and snowballed after an ESPN article in August portrayed the program as one in which staff members humiliated and bullied players in a way that has fallen out of favor in big-time college football. After that ESPN report, the university suspended 2 athletic trainers and reached an agreement for the resignation of the strength coach, Rick Court, who was depicted in the article as the ringleader of a toxic culture. Mr. Durkeen was hired after the university left the basketball-oriented Atlantic Coast Conference for the Big Ten, which could eventually net tens of millions of dollars more in revenue for Maryland. The ESPN report noted that some players had taken issue with Mr. Durkeen's intense style and the fact that Mr. Court was one of his first hires. The university's inquiry into the football program was formally released this week. But the board had it in hand last week as it met Mr. Lowe, Mr. Durkeen and Mr. Evans. The report partly blamed Mr. Durkeen, but it also partly absolved him, characterizing the first-time head coach, who was hired after the 2015 season, when he was just 37, as overmatched in his new job. It also said he had not received sufficient support from the athletic department or the university, given Maryland's lofty ambitions in its new conference. Mr. Durkeen was hired under high-pressure circumstances and tasked with turning a struggling football program into a Big Ten contender, with less funding and fan support than other conference programs, the report said. After reading the report, the majority of the board advocated ending Mr. Lowe's tenure as president. Word of the board's plans got back to Mr. Lowe, who requested a chance to make his case. When he spoke to the board last week, Mr. Lowe cautioned that abruptly changing leadership would destabilize the university. He also argued that he could help carry out changes recommended in the report. Finally, he warned that retaining Mr. Durkeen would send the campus into turmoil. Mr. Durkeen spoke later, and by several accounts was persuasive. He is an acolyte of two of college football's premier coaches, Urban Meyer of Ohio State and Jim Harbaugh of Michigan. After he spoke to the board, it decided not to fire him. By Monday, the board had decided that both Mr. Durkeen and Mr. Evans would stay. But the board does not have the authority to hire or fire university personnel other than the president. So Mr. Lowe, whom a majority still wanted to terminate, had to be the one to retain Mr. Durkeen and Mr. Evans. Instead of immediately being dismissed, Mr. Lowe was permitted to retire in June, at the end of the academic year. On Wednesday, Mr. Lowe had several meetings with campus department heads and deans, undergraduate student government leaders and the Faculty Senate's Executive Committee. Mr. Durkeen oversaw his first practice in nearly 3 months, though a clamor was growing on campus over his staying and Mr. Lowe's leaving. Image statements from deans and distinguished professors warned of what they characterized as inappropriate board interference. Students held a rally, while political leaders and even the chief of the university's foundation, an important fundraising arm, spoke out with disapproval. When Governor Hogan, who appointed many regents, and, if the polls are correct, stands to win re-election and appoint more, joined in the opposition to Mr. Durkeen's staying, the situation seemed untenable. Mr. Hogan was not privy to the regents' deliberations, according to a spokeswoman. Benjamin Jealous, his Democratic opponent, had called on him to fire board members, though Mr. Hogan lacks the authority to directly do so in the absence of extreme misconduct. But Mr. Lowe had already planned his move. On Halloween evening, he announced that he was defying the board and firing Mr. Durkeen. The chair of the Board of Regents has publicly acknowledged that I had previously raised serious concerns about Coach Durkeen's return, Mr. Lowe said, adding, however, a departure is in the best interest of the university. The politics of the moment, campus anger, national opprobrium, the disdain of donors, seemed at once to compel and vindicate Mr. Lowe's decision. As it turned out, Mr. Lowe outlasted not only Mr. Durkeen but also Mr. Brady, who resigned Thursday evening. I respect the many people, including elected leaders, members of the public and members of the board, who disagreed with the recommendations a majority of this board ultimately made, he said. The Maryland football team, under its interim head coach, Matt Canada, takes the field against Michigan State at home Saturday.